Today marks exactly 15 years since Assassin's Creed 2 launched way back in November of 2009, a game that still to this day stands out as one of Ubisoft's most acclaimed launches of all time and remains a genuine landmark in gaming history, not only for the incredible journey of the game itself, but also what it set in motion for the industry moving forward. Many of the open world or action adventure games we play today in 2024 still take a lot of inspiration from Assassin's Creed 2, and a lot of what makes a great single-player experience has stemmed from and eventually evolved from what this game brought to the table, not only in terms of gameplay elements, but especially when it comes to the use of open worlds and even the execution of great storytelling. While it was hardly the first game to ever achieve great open world design, the use of parkour or very solid combat, it does feel like it was potentially the first game to combine all of those ingredients together into what felt like a perfect storm, a lightning in a bottle moment that not only sparked the rest of the Assassin's Creed franchise to keep kicking on after the already successful first game, but it really does feel like it kickstarted the entire genre to become what it is today. Now, this game to me is easily one of my all-time favorites, and a game that I do still consider to this day to be one of the best games ever made. And so knowing that its 15-year anniversary was coming up this November, not only did I feel incredibly old having played it when it first came out back in 2009, but I also decided that I wanted to go back to the glory days of Assassin's Creed and give it another playthrough 15 years after it first arrived. Today, we're going to be taking a look at everything from the setting in the open world, its genre-defining elements, the gameplay from its amazing parkour to its basic yet enthralling combat, and lastly, its emotional, chaotic rollercoaster of a story to see whether the game really is as good as I always remembered it to be, or whether in fact the nostalgia was just clouding my judgment. The game starts us off right in the midst of it, leaving no time for us to get acquainted with the world before we're thrust into a chaotic story following Desmond Miles, the modern day protagonist of the story, played by the iconic Nolan North, who has no doubt voiced some of your other favorites, as well as Lucy Stillman, played by none other than Kirsten Bell. Now, the great thing about this intro is that anyone who played the first game will know exactly what's going on, and yet to anyone who played this as their first installment in the franchise, it's still a fantastic chaotic intro that does the perfect job of filling you in on everything you need to know without really making you feel like you've missed a whole lot in the previous game. I'll touch more on the actual story beats later on in the video, but like I said, Desmond is just the modern day protagonist of this game, yet not really the main protagonist, and so very quickly we're transported years back in time via the Animus to 15th century Renaissance Italy, where we iconically get to see the actual birth of the protagonist, Ezio Auditore da Firenze. Both figuratively and literally, Ezio is the vessel in which this story is able to be told, set against the stunning backdrop of the Italian Renaissance, which to me is still to this day the most iconic setting we've ever had throughout all these years of Assassin's Creed, and it even took one step further in the sequel to this game, Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. Right away, we are introduced to Firenze or Florence, and although some of the other cities in this game are equally as stunning, this to me is, and always will be, the single most iconic city in Assassin's Creed, and arguably one of the most iconic locations in just any open world game I've ever played. As a 13-year-old kid playing this game for the first time back in 2009, I remember just being completely blown away at the thought of having pretty much a whole city at my feet, with just about anything and everything being explorable, the majority of which was done by running across those iconic tiled rooftops and making the most of Ezio's parkour skills to traverse around the city. In this recent playthrough, I was actually still blown away at how alive this city and just every city in the game still feels even 15 years later. Even a lot of modern day games tend to struggle with making their maps and cities feel alive and lived in, but somehow all those years ago they really managed to pull that off to where even now I could still just spend hours on end running throughout the city of Florence without any goal or task to complete, and I genuinely don't know if I would ever get bored of it. As you progress through the story, you're introduced to multiple other cities too, with some being actual cities like Florence or Venice that we're introduced to a little bit later, while others are realistically just smaller towns such as Monteriggioni, a small commune in the province of Siena that becomes Ezio's base of operations throughout the game, to San Gimignano, a Templar heavy location that we visit multiple times, and finally Forli, a more depressing landscape that, despite always being gloomy and wet, still has a special charm about it that leaves you wanting to explore. While the smaller locations were amazing and still very crucial to the story, Florence and Venice are definitely the focal points of Assassin's Creed 2, with these cities being where we spend the very large majority of our time, and you can tell that this is where they spent a lot of their development time due to just how detailed and realistic these cities are, all the while still being gamified enough that they're genuinely a blast to run around and explore in. Perfectly replicating a city doesn't necessarily always result in a fun experience for players, because at the end of the day, those locations aren't made for a video game, they're made for real life. But with Assassin's Creed 2 and really just the whole Ezio trilogy, they really managed to find that perfect balance between making the cities true to form, realistic, and feeling very much lived in, all the while feeling like a big sandbox for us as the players to run around in. Now, Florence to me was essentially flawless, while Venice on the other hand, I have to say I have somewhat of a love-hate relationship there. While I think it's objectively a fantastic map and just general play space, I also find myself hating some of the water-filled sections, as often you'll be in an awesome rhythm running along rooftops and climbing buildings, only to then be required to dive into the water and slowly but surely swim across a canal to get to the other side if you can't manage to find a bridge somewhere nearby. That being said, that's also part of what makes each of these cities feel special. They feel unique, they feel like they have a sort of identity, and each city feels iconic for their very own reasons, despite how easy it would be for each of them to feel completely identical. Hell, even Venice itself somewhat transforms throughout the game, as there is a decent chunk of time here towards the end of the game that takes place during Carnival, the iconic festival in Venice, and the city transforms into essentially a huge party, with jesters found on every corner doing tricks in the streets, to fireworks, to countless events taking place at any given time, and it almost feels like it is a completely different location than the Venice that we're used to seeing throughout the rest of our time here. This game just did a phenomenal job at feeling authentic to the cities and time period that it's set in. Not that I was alive during 15th century Italy, of course, but it really does feel like this game is somewhat of a time capsule in which we get to take a peek through the curtains at what these cities looked and felt like back in the Italian Renaissance, and even looking at cities like Florence or Venice right now in 2024, the game clearly did a fantastic job at staying as true as possible to the real locations, albeit bending the rules in a few areas in order to give themselves a little bit more freedom to tell the story they wanted to. Still to this day, 15 years later, the overall setting of Assassin's Creed 2 is as iconic as they come, and each time I take a trip back here, it quickly reminds me how much Ubisoft set the tone for the rest of this genre moving forward. One of the key areas in which I consider Assassin's Creed 2 to be genre defining is essentially what we just talked about. Its incredible use of open worlds in a way that I personally don't believe had been done to this level before, at least not as polished and refined as it was in this game. Don't get me wrong, it's not the first open world game ever made by any means. Hell, it's the second game in the franchise. Obviously, the original Assassin's Creed was open world too for the most part, as well as so many countless classics from the 2000s, like some of the GTA games, Fallout 3, the Stalker trilogy, Oblivion, and really I could just go on and on and on. But to me, even though some of those games I mentioned are phenomenal in their own right and had amazing open worlds too, when I look back to this era of gaming, Assassin's Creed 2 is always the game that I think of first when I'm thinking about open worlds, due to how it pushed the envelope for that genre while almost combining the action adventure genre into the same game, which is where I don't feel like this had really really ever been done, at least not to this level. The use of parkour was also something that genuinely took level design to the next step in its evolution, simply by adding a level of verticality and freedom that we'd never really seen before. In most games before this, especially when it comes to open world games, with the exception probably being the original Assassin's Creed, video game levels were, for the most part, designed on the ground, and even when there were maps with some verticality to them, it wasn't quite the same walking up a set of stairs or climbing a ladder that would get you up to that rooftop compared to simply scaling the building whichever way you wanted. And the only game I can really remember from way back then that did that was probably some of those early Spider-Man games on the Xbox. It might seem so simple and so common for us now in 2024, where most games do give players a hell of a lot of freedom, but back in 2009, the ability to just choose how you wanted to approach a mission, whether you wanted to attack the enemy from the ground, jump down from a rooftop, or even use a crowd of civilians to sneak up unnoticed in order to use your hidden pistol, that is something that I remember thinking all those years ago was genuinely special. Again, it wasn't the first game to ever give us freedom, but at that time, it was probably the best iteration of that freedom that we'd ever been able to play up until that point. Even just looking at specifically the parkour mechanics, there's almost a countless amount of games that have very clearly taken that idea and implemented it into their own games over the last 15 years, some of which are just as iconic as Assassin's Creed. Immediately, I think of games like pretty much all of the Uncharted series, the Arkham games, Shadow of Mordor, which I actually just covered on this channel last month, and even in more recent times, games like Ghost of Tsushima, Horizon Zero Dawn, and Forbidden West, hell, even to an extent the Jedi games in Jedi Fallen Order and Jedi Survivor. All of those games draw very clear inspiration from the Assassin's Creed franchise, and while of course the original game was legendary in its own right, I'm sure most people would agree that Assassin's Creed 2 and the following two games in the Ezio trilogy really did take that franchise to the next level, to where it became probably one of the most iconic franchises in the industry, despite the state that it has been in more recent years anyway. Now, obviously, some of the games I just mentioned, most notably Ghost of Tsushima and probably Uncharted as well, have absolutely overtaken Assassin's Creed, especially when it comes to the newer games. I think I'd almost have to argue that Ghost of Tsushima is a better game than any Assassin's Creed game ever was, if we're looking at them as a whole, but that doesn't change the fact that what this game did back in 2009 really did set the tone for these sorts of games. And I guess it's fairly easy to use that famous old saying of Assassin's Creed 2 walked so that those games could run. But even saying that right now, it feels wrong. It feels like a disservice to Assassin's Creed 2 to say that it walked so that those games could run, because honestly, if those games were running, then Assassin's Creed 2 most certainly ran as well. It was just as amazing as those games, and 15 years later in this recent playthrough, it still does feel to me like a genuinely great game outside of some of those clearly outdated areas, like a bit of clunkiness in the movement or some of the very heavy NPC dialogue that feels like it's kind of straight out of those Skyrim memes. I genuinely wonder what modern day open world action adventure games would be like right now if it weren't for this game and its sequels. It might sound like an extreme thing to say, maybe I need to go and find a tinfoil hat for this one, but I genuinely don't think some of the classics we've had over the years would exist, or at the very least be nearly as good as they are, if it weren't for this game. And because of that, going back to what I said earlier, Assassin's Creed 2 really does feel like a pretty massive landmark in gaming history. Now, Assassin's Creed 2 didn't really break new ground when it comes to each individual gameplay mechanic. The hand-to-hand combat was fairly simple and standard, albeit still very fun. The stealth was much the same. In fact, it was actually kind of lacking a little bit compared to games like Metal Gear Solid or the Arkham games, although again, at the time it was still very solid. But to me, it was the combination of the stealth, the combat, and the parkour all jumbled into one that to me is what defines Assassin's Creed as a franchise and makes it stand out from most other games of a similar nature. While the first Assassin's Creed game was great, it did leave a lot to be desired in a few areas, and as good as it was a very simple and straightforward game, even at the time back in 2007. Assassin's Creed 2, however, took everything the first game did well, improved on that pretty drastically, while also expanding on those areas more than any anyone probably expected in the 2 years since the previous game. And my god, if you go back and play both of those games in a row, you will definitely notice the difference. First and foremost, the actual hand-to-hand combat was drastically improved from the first game, as the only real mechanic that game had was an attack and a counter-attack. But Assassin's Creed 2 saw many more weapon types, as well as the ability to carry more weapons at once. We got dual hidden blades, allowing us to kill 2 enemies at once from stealth. We even got small daggers and ranged attacks like throwing knives and the iconic hidden pistol that really added a whole other level to Ezio's arsenal and allowed us to be deadly in more ways than we expected. It also just felt a hell of a lot smoother than the first game, feeling like you could chain together kill after kill, being able to disarm enemies, and even just having a much bigger variety of finishing moves that resulted in some of the most cinematic combat we'd probably ever seen at that time. Those improvements didn't just come in the form of combat though. The parkour was drastically improved in this game, being much more free-flowing and enjoyable, and while the majority of that was down to the actual movement and the animations, a lot of it was simply down to much better level design, with the devs clearly taking notes from the first game on where and when to add that little extra section of a building for us to continue on with our parkour rhythm without being interrupted. One of the most notable additions to the parkour was also added midway through the game in the form of a new ability that you could learn, the ability to essentially leap upwards from a hanging position while you were climbing and grab a ledge above you to continue climbing even faster. This was not only a great addition that kept the parkour fast-paced and free-flowing, but it made perfect sense as to when it was added and allowed them to introduce a new character called Rosa, as Ezio had seen her and her buddies climbing that way and wanted to learn for himself. I don't take stuff like that for granted, and I really appreciate the way that that was done, because back in 2009, and especially before that, games weren't always as subtle at introducing new mechanics in a way that made sense not only to the gameplay, but also to the story. Ironically, this exact ability to jump and essentially speed up the process of climbing was taken a step further in the third game of the trilogy, Assassin's Creed Revelations, where Ezio gets a new piece of equipment that allows him to spring upwards quickly and hook onto ledges, which again improved the player experience while also making perfect sense to the story. Ezio was older at that point, and he needed something to sort of pick up the pace that he'd lost over the years, and I don't know, I just really appreciate when mechanics or gameplay implementations like that are added that not only improve the game, but actually have a reason to be added as well. But it wasn't just the key areas of the gameplay like the combat or the parkour that were improved in Assassin's Creed 2. It was also a lot of the more subtle, insignificant elements that to me made the game feel like it was such an astronomical step up from the first game. The bones of that first game were strong, the combat was fun, the stealth and parkour were exciting, and the overall story and just mystery of Altair were very intriguing to say the least. But outside of that, there wasn't too much to the game at all. Assassin's Creed 2 fixed that by adding so many little quality of life changes, so many small but enjoyable mechanics that made it feel like a true open world experience, like there was a reason to go off exploring in between missions and get lost in the world that we were in. Little things like the addition of the notoriety system, where you'd eventually garner a reputation after committing a certain amount of crimes, that just made perfect sense and really did make the game not only more enjoyable, but also a tad more realistic too. In the first game, escaping notoriety was as simple as just breaking line of sight with your enemies. If they couldn't see you, then they essentially didn't even know you existed. But in Assassin's Creed 2, it felt real and it sort of felt personal in a way. Kill enough guards around the city and the city guard would eventually learn who you are and realize that there is an assassin on the loose that they need to be keeping an eye out for, which would really make missions a lot more difficult if you needed to stay hidden and under the radar. To counter this though, if you had a high enough notoriety, then there were multiple ways to reduce it, either taking down wanted posters throughout the city to remove your face from people's subconscious mind, to bribing heralds in the street who you could audibly hear talking about you while you ran around the rooftops, to even assassinating political officials in order to stop the spread of your name throughout areas of the city. All of this made Ezio feel like he was an actual assassin, or at times even a myth that you would hear civilians talking about throughout throughout the city. And as simple of a mechanic as it was, it really did add so much to the game that I really think we took for granted just due to how many other awesome implementations we saw too. It was almost hard to keep track of all these little additions, and yet you could tell they all really added up together to increase that overall quality by so much more than the first game. While it definitely feels aged and a little bit clunky in a few areas after 15 long years, I think that is obviously to be expected, and honestly, it felt better gameplay wise than I actually expected it to after all this time. I mentioned it earlier, but this game really did combine so many great elements in the stealth, the parkour, and the general combat into what felt like a perfect storm, especially when it was mixed up with the mysterious, intriguing, and now iconic character of Ezio Auditore. The story of Assassin's Creed 2 and its overall timeline is pretty unique just from the fact that it actually takes place over the course of 23 years compared to the mere 2-month timeline of the first game, and honestly it's pretty easy to actually miss that in this game if you're not paying attention to the timeline markers that show up in the bottom right at the beginning of each new sequence, because I'll be honest, most of these characters do not really age at all. Now, outside of the actual birth of the character that I talked about before, our time with Ezio starts in the year 1476, and immediately we're thrown right into the thick of it, taking part in essentially a street brawl between Ezio and his friends, and his biggest rival in Vieri de Pazzi. In these opening scenes, Ezio is clearly set up as a brash, arrogant, but also charming young man whose life is filled with adventure, chaos, romance, and generally just the freedom that comes with being in a privileged position due to his noble family. But very quickly in this story, Ezio is thrust into tragedy after political betrayal leads to the brutal and completely unexpected murder of his father Giovanni, alongside his two brothers Federico and Petruchio, the latter of which is only a mere 13 years old when he was publicly executed. From this moment on, Ezio's entire world has changed, and this essentially sets in motion his eventual transformation from a mostly innocent nobleman to one of the most feared assassins the world had ever seen. Despite losing his father and brothers, pretty much the only male figures in his life, Ezio eventually meets up with his uncle Mario, who, unbeknownst to Ezio, is subtly teaching him the ways of the assassins during his training, a group that Ezio didn't even know existed at this point in the story. As far as Ezio is concerned, his only goal is to seek revenge and redemption from those who took his father and brothers away from him, but Mario has a clearer vision of the bigger picture. It turns out that as Ezio continues to grow, hone his skills, and eventually begin to take out some of the targets he has as revenge for the death of his family members, he starts to find threads of a bigger story as well, and it eventually becomes more and more clear that this whole thing is part of a bigger story, a story between two ancient groups known as the Assassins and their bitter rivals in the Templars. The interesting element to keep in mind through all of this though is that this story of Ezio and his desire for revenge is only part of the story we're being told, which we as the player are actually seeing through the eyes, or I guess the memories, of Desmond Miles, the modern day protagonist who links this entire story together. And so this game is actually kind of a story within a story. Desmond, who very much does mirror Ezio in a lot of ways, doesn't fully understand just what the hell is going on. Instead, he's just found himself mixed up in some sort of war that he doesn't even understand. Through the Animus, a special sort of machine that allows users to access the memories of their ancestors through the strands in their DNA, Desmond is able to take a look back over 500 years ago to the life that his ancestor Ezio lived in order for himself, Lucy, Sean, and Rebecca to piece together the story. As they follow along through Ezio's journey, we see a very clear character arc from Ezio, turning from that brash, adventurous young man to a compassionate, fearless leader who begins to uncover more and more about the Assassin's Brotherhood Brotherhood and their opposing Templar enemies. It's at these moments throughout the game that we see Ezio's motivations shift from his initial desire to simply exact revenge on those who wronged his family, to understanding that there's a need for a much broader sense of purpose in his overall story. Despite the countless targets that Ezio is tasked with hunting down throughout the game, the man behind it all is Rodrigo Borgia, a real historical figure who is more commonly known as Pope Alexander VI, and this is just one of many real historical figures who show up throughout the events of this game, as well as its sequels. Players also get to meet the one and only Leonardo da Vinci, who becomes one of Ezio's most prominent and trusted friends, using his brilliant mind to design blueprints to new equipment for Ezio, as well as deciphering many of the ancient codex pages that no one else is smart enough to comprehend. Throughout this story, we also meet countless other real historical figures, the likes of Niccolo Machiavelli, Caterina Sforza, Lorenzo de' Medici, and honestly about half of Ezio's targets in this game are also real historical figures, albeit all of their stories are obviously very much altered to fit the narrative of this game. This to me is one of the areas that this game does so well when it comes to the overall storytelling. Its ability to take a real life time period filled with real life historical figures and essentially change everything we know about those people to fit an entire new mysterious story. Almost like this game is telling the true story of that time that the world just doesn't know about. It almost feels like we're uncovering the real plot of exactly what went on in 15th century Italy. As we get closer to the end of the game, however, it becomes pretty damn obvious that this is not a true story, because it becomes pretty wild and wacky at points, but I still feel like it does a great job for the most part of taking these real life characters and almost making it seem like this game is telling the actual truth of what went on back in those times. And to me, it is just as interesting and enthralling this time around as it was when I was a 13-year-old kid. The story ends with Ezio brutally forcing his way into the Vatican in order to hunt down Rodrigo Borgia, who at this time was the Pope and a very powerful man, in order to take his papal staff and combine that with the Apple of Eden that we'd come to learn about throughout the game, which would then allow Ezio to uncover all of the secrets that we're chasing throughout the story. After looking as though he'd finally exact revenge on Borgia after all of these years, Ezio actually decides to let him live, saying, "Killing you won't bring my family back," and so this leaves a very open-ended story for the sequel. The end of this game comes with a phenomenal twist though that still to this day is what I consider to be one of the most iconic endings to pretty much any game that I've ever played. Ezio uses the staff and the apple to uncover the vault, and inside he encounters a holographic projection of Minerva, who refers to herself as one of those who came before. She tells a story of those who came before, telling Ezio that there was essentially an entire civilization prior to the human race who were wiped out after a catastrophic event, and she's here to warn Ezio of a similar disaster that could threaten humanity once again. But the real kicker is she's not even talking to Ezio in this moment. She's actually talking directly to Desmond 500 years in the future, almost like she's talking through the video game to us as the player, and it still gave me chills seeing it this time around, 15 years after my first experience of it. This moment revealed that although the story of Ezio was an awesome journey in itself, there was so much more to this story that we didn't yet understand, and I still remember all the way back in 2009 being absolutely blown away to the point that I just needed the next game to arrive so that I could unearth what the hell was going on. Ezio's story is one of family, loss, vengeance, and loyalty, but ultimately it is the story of a much bigger picture in which Ezio is only a small cog in the machine. And to me, this story, whether it's this standalone game or just the entire Ezio trilogy, is still to this day one of the most enjoyable, captivating stories that I've been able to experience in all my years of gaming. So to tie this all together, I think it's fair to say that 15 years later, this game is still absolutely worth playing, and despite this year being easily the busiest year of my life to date, not only in my personal life but also here on YouTube covering multiple other games, I could not be happier that I still managed to find the time to squeeze in yet another playthrough of what I think is still to this day one of the best video games that's ever been released. While it wasn't initially part of my plans, as I've been meaning to cover God of War Ragnarok in an upcoming video, I enjoyed this trip down memory lane so much that I've actually decided decided to cover both Assassin's Creed Brotherhood and Assassin's Creed Revelations right here on the channel, and so you can expect to see a similar video to this one covering both of those games in the near future. Assassin's Creed 2 is far from perfect. It has some areas in which it definitely could have been improved and maybe left fans wanting more, but at the end of the day, it is still one of the most genre-defining games of its generation, and like I mentioned before, I genuinely don't know if the gaming landscape would be quite the same today if this game never released. If you've never played the Ezio trilogy before, I could not recommend it enough to go and give them a try, and hell, even for those of you old school fans like myself who have played it, maybe this video is a sign that it's time to run it back one last time and go on another journey with Ezio and Desmond. Trust me, you will not be disappointed. For those still watching all the way through to the end, I just want to say a massive thank you for the support, and hopefully you've enjoyed this video enough to consider subscribing, because like I said, there is plenty more content on the way just like this. Like I mentioned, next up we're covering Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, my personal favorite game within the trilogy, and probably just the Assassin's Creed franchise as a whole, and I cannot wait to take you guys on another trip down memory lane with that classic as well, followed closely by the also classic Assassin's Creed Revelations. And don't worry guys, that God of War Ragnarok video will come at some point down the line. I'm just having way too much fun right now with these old Assassin's Creed games, but I promise it will be here eventually. Thank you all so much for watching. You guys have a great day, and I'll catch you all in the next one.